Hello, welcome to a video lecture that I prepared for you with my lecture notes on Chapter 9 in our text, Sex, Subjectivity, and Representation. Some of the key concepts that we'll be covering in this lecture and that are covered in this chapter: femininity, feminism, gender, identification, masculinity, patriarchy, performativity, representation, subject position, and transgender. In order to discuss questions of sex and gender, it's necessary to engage with a large body of feminist theory. It would be impossible to conceive of cultural studies that did not do so. However, while feminist thinking permeates cultural studies, not all forms of feminism are to be thought of as cultural studies, nor are all zones of cultural studies concerned with questions of gender, though many feminists might argue that they should be. Both cultural studies and feminism have shared a substantive interest in issues of power, representation, popular culture, subjectivity, identities, and consumption. And as this quote says here, feminism puts questions of sexuality, gender, subjectivity, and power at the heart of cultural studies. As a movement, feminism has been concerned with two key issues. First, to win citizen rights such as voting and equality before the law. Second, to influence cultural representations and norms in ways that are beneficial to women. Whether you've heard it or not, there are basically three main waves of feminism. First wave, the 19th century, early 20th century, focusing mainly on suffrage and other legal rights, most active in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, succeeded in gaining women the right to vote, other legal liberties. Many first-wave feminists were also involved with the temperance, which is basically prohibition against drink and alcohol, and abolitionist movements, which is removing slavery. While the suffragettes, which is what they were called, the women seeking the right to vote, were seeking equality with men in terms of the right to vote, there was also a sense that women were morally superior to men, making it a version of difference feminism. Second wave feminist movement began in the U.S. During the 1960s primarily. Basically went from the 1960s and the 1990s. This period of feminist history associated with radical activism, such as theatrical protests at the Miss America pageants, when makeup, high heels, and bras were thrown into rubbish bins in front of reporters. Began in the U.S., focused mainly on sexuality, reproductive rights, the wage gap. The movement succeeded in securing career options for women and many reproductive rights. But obviously, many of these issues are still being worked out, challenged, and moved forward. So we still don't have equal pay for men and women in the United States, at least. And so second wave feminism is still very much alive today. Third wave feminism is regarded as having begun in the mid-1990s and is associated with rebellion of younger women against what was perceived as the prescriptive, pushy, and sex-negative approach of older feminists. The characteristics of third wave feminism, which is a term sometimes used interchangeably with post-feminism, but not always. Some people see post-feminism as different, but characteristics of third wave feminism include an emphasis on differences among women due to race, ethnicity, class, nationality, and religion, individual and do-it-yourself tactics as opposed to collective politics, fluid and multiple subject positions and identities, cyber activism, the reappropriation of derogatory terms such as slut and bitch for liberatory purposes, and sex positivity. As this graphic shows here, third wave Third wave feminism is oftentimes associated with overthrowing patriarchy, patriarchy being the predisposition that men are the head of the family and the household, and that has not always been the case. In ancient Scotland, Caledonia, they lived in a matriarchy. Women were the head of the family. So, third wave feminism fights for equality. We see it on social media, mostly upper and middle class Americans, and also concerns itself with rape culture. There are some limits of the wave metaphor. Wave theory has been questioned for privileging history at the expense of ideas and focusing on an extremely limited historical period in an extremely limited set of cultural conditions. That is, the feminist activities of white women in the West over the past 1.5 centuries, and not really beyond that. So, okay, moving along. Our text also breaks this down into liberal and socialist feminism, difference feminism, black and post-colonial feminism, and post-structuralist feminism. And I'm not going to go into depth on those. I'm trying to keep a focus pretty much on a more general level of popular culture. And but these are important distinctions, and if you're interested in looking into these further, please consult our text. There's plenty of information there. And feminism, first, second, third wave feminism have resulted in many gains for women, and some of these are listed here. Significant gains in the economy, increased visibility for women in the cultural sphere, transformation of knowledge in the academy, changes in sexual attitudes and behavior, reform of pay and divorce laws, recognition of male loss and vulnerability. So, in terms of, to a certain extent, feminism has helped to alter our perceptions of masculinity. So, it's okay for men to be vulnerable, to have feelings, to cry. And women can wield sexual and other forms of power as well. Okay, and so as mentioned already, there is also this term post-feminism, and kind of a contested term deployed in different ways with different meanings depending on the context. Sometimes used interchangeably with third wave feminism. Oftentimes referred to a pastness of feminism, what we might call post-feminism, obviously, akin to post-racism, and oftentimes, again, that's something that, like with post-racism, that's maybe shared by people who are in a more privileged position, white, upper class, women especially, might think of themselves as being post-feminists, that they don't need to concern themselves with feminism anymore, that they're moving beyond it, and that somehow feminism is kind of playing the victim and is holding women's progress back at this point. So, post-feminist women, oftentimes said to enjoy cultural life she chooses, want to escape the sense that women are passive victims of patriarchy, which they suggest was inference to feminist campaigning. The performance of victim identity reinforces the myth that women are the weaker sex and risk perpetuating the power dynamic inherent between victim and perpetrator, or victim and voyeur. So, again, this is debatable, controversial, and frequently shared by women who have enjoyed many of the benefits of the feminist movement. A critique of post-feminism is that liberation is only available to those who can afford to pay for it. So there's kind of a commodity-centric view of post-feminism. Many feminist writers disagree with the broad argument advanced by those post-feminists who suggest feminism's biggest battles have been won. They point to continued inequality for women in the workplace and the reproduction of cultural representations and practices that exclude or demean women. Changes in digital cultures have also created entirely new domains for and modes of misogynist harassment. Some people see the term sex as mainly in relation to physiological or biological markers, whereas the word gender oftentimes refers to a way people identify themselves away from physical characteristics. So also, probably 50 years ago or so, sex was primarily physiological and gender was primarily grammatical. So his and her and him and she, but gender has taken on a larger meaning than just grammatical over time. In terms of breaking down the binary, female and male historically have been an organizing principle for categorizing humans. Seems like a natural approach, but recent advances in science of sex show that even at the biological level, a surprising number of people do not fit neatly into the category of female or male. And so, oftentimes when a baby is born, there's some confusion about maleness or femaleness, and ironically, historically, if the baby seems to have an underdeveloped penis, they will oftentimes reassign it as a female. So the apparent belief that nobody could be a fully developed man without a fully fledged phallus or penis has governed many of those decisions, and obviously that's unfortunate. One alternative to rely on a simple binary of female and male is to imagine a biological spectrum instead of categories, either or, placing things along a spectrum that you can have extreme female at one end of the spectrum and extreme male at the other end, and that there can be variation along the spectrum. So it's not always a simple binary. Elsewhere in this section of our text, there's some discussion of women's difference and this thinker Irigaray and women speak, and I really didn't have too much to say about that at this point, so I'm going to move on. In terms of the social construction of sex and gender, gender is viewed as a cultural construct, and so malleable in a way that aspects of biology may not be. So it's important to distinguish between gender and biology here. Within cultural studies, the argument that femininity and masculinity are malleable social constructions has taken its inspiration from the work of Foucault and also from psychoanalysis. The body and sexuality are major themes in Foucault's work, and he has argued that sexuality was a focal point for the exercise of power and the production of subjectivity in Western society. According to Foucault, wherever discursive power operates, so also does resistance become possible, not least through the production of reverse discourses, counter-hegemonic discourses, challenging the established regime of power and working toward regime change. Foucault's description of subjects as docile bodies, where subjects are the effect of discourse, has been of concern to many feminists because it appears to rob subjects of the agency required for an emancipatory project. However, it's arguable that Foucault's later work, which centered on techniques of the self, does reintroduce agency and the possibility of resistance and change. In terms of psychoanalysis, obviously the biggest name in that area is Sigmund Freud, but I've also posted a kind of a cartoonish or drawing version, illustrated version of Julia Kristeva. Julia Kristeva, influenced by Lacan. She is a psychoanalyst who's attracted most attention within feminist cultural studies, and her work is centrally concerned with signs and semiotics. That is the way the symbolic order of culture. Her work is organized around questions of subjectivity and identity. She is a practicing psychoanalyst, and her work explores the way that psychic forces are intertwined with cultural texts. Another big name in feminist scholarship is Judith Butler, and she kind of exists between Foucault and psychoanalysis, Freud, Kristeva, and she discusses many things about the performativity of sex, that we take on sexuality, that we perform it, and one of the things that she looks at is dressing in drag, recasting the symbolic. And so Butler argues that drag can destabilize and recast gender norms through a resignification of the ideals of gender. Through a miming of gender norms, drag can be subversive to the extent that it reflects on the performative character of gender. The term drag is usually associated with men and male homosexuality, yet it has also become increasingly popular for women to explore similar performances as drag kings, kind of in parallel to drag queens. So one of the things that we see here with this image is that drag queens, in terms of performative, they take it almost to a higher art form, that it's being even more feminine than most women are feminine, that really escalating the performativity of sex. So not just dressing as a woman, but really taking it to a great extent. So you may also have heard of the term queer theory. Basically, queer is taking a term that has been highly negative, pejorative, insulting in the past, and re-articulating it, re-signifying it in a positive vein. It can also be seen as more inclusive than maybe gay, because oftentimes people will say gay and lesbian. So gay is, in that sense, more associated with male homosexuality, and lesbian with female homosexuality. So queer can be more encompassing than that. And we see this often with terminology, that people will take ownership of this term that has been used negatively, and then by taking ownership of it, they can make it more positive from that point forward. So our text does talk about an alphabet soup associated with queer theory, and I think that the one that they was most complicated that they came up with was LGBTQQIAAPP, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, allies, polyamorous, and pansexual. So definitely a mouthful. Some other acronyms or abbreviations that have been used. GSM for gender and sexual minorities, GSD for gender and sexual diversities, and Q-munity, a combination of the word queer and community. We also have in this chapter a discussion of men and masculinity. And masculinity can also be understood as a cultural construct. Historically, traditional masculinity has encompassed the values of strength, power, stoicism, action, control, independence, self-sufficiency, male camaraderie and mateship, and work. Devalued relationships were devalued were relationships, verbal ability, domestic life, tenderness, communication, women, and children. So we're seeing a change in that currently in our society. Also in this chapter, there's a section on gender representation in media culture, and they're looking in a part of this section at images of women. I didn't have too much to say about these as well, so I'm going to let you, if you want to know more, explore them on your own. One thing that I did want to talk about was gendered toys, color coding, and Barbie. And so we're all familiar with blue is for boys and pink is for girls. And interestingly, that hasn't always been that way. At one time, boys and girls were dressed in white up until the age of about 6, and then dressed in more colorful colors at that point. And at one point, things were the opposite, that pink was seen as more expressive, vibrant, and so it was assigned to boys, and blue was seen as more peaceful and calm, and it was assigned to girls, and things kind of flipped around in the early 20th century. So, and in terms of gendered toys, we oftentimes see toys that are associated with beauty or homekeeping or things like that, associated with girls. And not only do our boys' toys oftentimes, more aggressive, but interestingly, sometimes toys that are associated with learning are also kind of gender biased toward boys. In many large department stores, toys in the pink is for girls aisles often include household appliances, vanity mirrors with makeup, princess and fairy paraphernalia, and dolls, some of which require feeding and nappy changing. Toys in the blues for boys aisles tend to be stocked with weapons, building equipment, transport units such as cars, buses, and trains, and as I mentioned, educational toys are often located in the blue zone in the toy aisles. So that's certainly concerning. While many representations of gender in popular culture remain dominated by stereotypes, there are signs of change. The internationally popular Cartoon Network series Adventure Time depicts gender in a number of what we might think of as subversive ways. The inclusion of roughly equal numbers of female and male characters, the inclusion of characters who have multiple and/or indeterminate genders, the use of gendered design elements such as eyelashes and facial hair to illustrate character traits rather than as blunt gender signaling instruments, the distribution of traits such as intelligence, courage, loyalty, power, lust, sentimentality, selfishness, altruism, artistic temperaments, and a gross sense of humor equally among characters regardless of their gender, and the use of characterizations and plot devices which frame gender and identity as being fluid rather than fixed, and the inclusion of queer and transgender subtexts. Possibly one of the most disturbing aspects of gender representation in media culture has been the emphasis on the slender body for women. So oftentimes unattainable, such as a Barbie doll. Slenderness and a concern with dieting and self-monitoring are preoccupations of Western media culture, with its interest in a tighter, smoother, more constrained body profile. Consequently, advertising targets bulge, fat, or flab, and the desirability of flat stomachs and cellulite management. Slenderness is a contemporary ideal for female attractiveness, so that girls and women are culturally more prone to eating disorders than are men. which is highly concerning. There is a phenomenon of manorexia, men who are also prone to issues of anorexia. And interestingly, in terms of Western culture, things like anorexia and bulimia are not found in sub-Saharan Africa, where people are concerned about just getting enough to eat. Um, Anorexia and bulimia are not found at all. It's more a product of Western culture and affluent culture. Um, so, as much as affluence gives us great things, it also gives us great maladies, I guess you would say, as well. Okay, so one of the big figures in terms of sex, subjectivity, and representation is Madonna, and Madonna's videos have been shown to seek to empower women by exhorting them to take control of their lives. Madonna frequently plays with codes of sex and gender to blur the boundaries of masculinity and femininity. I think that Lady Gaga has taken this even further, which we'll discuss here in a second. We also have this phenomenon of raunch culture. And so basically, raunch culture, sometimes referred to as post-feminism, women feeling more empowered with their bodies, that highly charged sexuality in strip clubs, questions of whether the women are being exploited or whether they are empowered. Again, I think that these are frequently positions of people who have, derived much benefit from the feminist movement. So, raunch culture, very much a product of third wave feminism, came about as a reaction to the taboos against female sexuality found among both moral conservatives and second wave feminists in the late 80s and early 90s, championing women who worked in the sex industry and reclaiming toxic age-old accusations such as slut emerged as important political enterprises. Critics of raunch culture argue that it advocates female and sexual provocativeness and promiscuousness by deploying references to pornography and by celebrating sexual objectification and physicality. Women identifying with this culture speak of their rights to objectify sexuality like a man, including looking at and enacting pornography. These women frequently reject the idea that women should behave as victims and claim the right to do whatever they want to with their bodies and to look how they wish. This includes the use of plastic surgery should they desire it. Raunch culture has been celebrated as post-feminist. The argument is that as women, they no longer have to be concerned about objectification by men per se. Rather, they're entitled to rejoice in their own sexuality and to act on it in an assertive and even predatory way as men do. Okay, and so as I mentioned already, Lady Gaga has oftentimes been seen as having taken what Madonna has done and taking it even further. And so Lady Gaga is oftentimes best framed not in terms of being different to Madonna, but as extending the approaches of the Material Girl. Indeed, it could be said that Gaga out-Madonnas Madonna. Madonna has been known for engaging in a series of relatively orderly reinventions over the course of her lengthy and ongoing career. Lady Gaga, in contrast, presents as being in a near constant state of metamorphosis. Lady Gaga's playfulness with sex, gender, and performance identities has oftentimes even sparked rumors that she is intersex. The final section in this chapter deals with gender in cyberspace, and cyberspace certainly allows for an ambiguity of gender identity, has led some thinkers to explore the feminist potentials of cyberspace. The image that I have here is the character H in Ready Player One. And so we first get introduced to H as the character on the left, very masculine, and then we find out by the end of the movie that H is the woman on the right. And while cyberculture, cyberspace allows for pushing gender boundaries, it has also oftentimes hindered those expressions. Avatars are oftentimes constrained by Western ideals of beauty, small waists, big breasts, wide shoulders. Small waists, big breasts for women, wide shoulders and muscles for men, and behavior coded as masculine or feminine, and the culture is carried over into cyber gaming. Even many non-human avatars come in recognizably male or female options. We also have the issue of gendered cyber hate. The internet can be liberating for many people in many ways, but we've also seen the flip side of that. An increase in the volume of gendered hate speech online. Cyber hate sometimes comes in the form of rape threats, sexualized vitriol. In gamer communities, there's oftentimes perceived to be a misogynistic backlash, and there's also been incidents of doxing people online and publishing, their names, their addresses, their phone numbers, and putting them in, imperiling them to where they have to worry about their personal safety. And we've also seen the prevalence of what has been called revenge porn, the uploading of sexually explicit material, usually of a former female partner, without the consent of the person pictured. So I think that's all I've got on sex, subjectivity, and representation for this lecture. And thank you for taking the time to watch it. And I'll be posting more material as we move forward. Thank you very much.